Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. The heavy wooden door of the district survey office slammed shut against the biting autumn wind, leaving Mark alone in the dim quiet of the archive room where 50 years of faded topographic maps hung from rusted steel racks like drying hides. His fingers traced the yellowed edges of a quadrangle grid marked Southwest Virginia, 1972. Noticing for the third time that morning how the contour lines simply stopped dead along the eastern wall of the drainage basin, as if the cartographer's pen had run completely dry or been forcibly yanked off the linen. The head surveyor had handed him the assignment with a brief indifferent nod 3 hours ago, telling him it was just a routine boundary verification for a timber company looking to cut the upper ridge before the heavy winter rains turned the mountain roads into impassable troughs of red clay. But Mark knew from his 10 years in the field that true dead spots on a state survey were never routine. They were administrative errors left behind by men who got tired of fighting the terrain or missing men whose notebooks were recovered floating in shallow creeks, miles away from their last recorded coordinates. He packed his leather satchel with dual brass compasses, 3 spools of high, visibility orange survey ribbon, a mechanical tally counter, and a fresh leather, bound logbook, stepping out into the cold drizzle that had begun to slick the gravel parking lot. The old green pickup truck rattled violently as he shifted into low gear for the steep climb up the county access road, the asphalt giving way after 4 miles to deeply rutted dirt path, covered in a wet carpet of rotted oak leaves. As the elevation climbed past 2,000 feet, the canopy closed tightly overhead, blocking out what little gray daylight remained in the sky and turning the surrounding forest into a wall of dark looming silhouettes. The air inside the cab grew colder despite the heater humming at full blast, carrying a faint metallic tang that smelled distinctly of rusted iron and stagnant river mud. Mark checked his odometer as he crossed the last wooden culvert, noting the exact mileage, before pulling the truck off into a narrow turnaround choked with wild blackberry brambles. He stepped out into the damp chill and pulled his oilskin coat tight around his shoulders. Listening to the absolute silence that hung over the hollow, there were no crows calling from the ridgeline, no squirrels chattering in the brush, not even the drip of water from the pine needles above. Just the soft rhythmic ticking of his cooling engine. He unlatched the tailgate to haul out his heavy wooden tripod and the brass transit scope, adjusting the leather straps across his chest until the weight rested evenly against his spine. His first sightline was supposed to anchor on a marked survey pin set into a granite boulder at the edge of the creek. But when he approached the streambed, he found the water running entirely black, thick and slow like old engine oil, completely silent as it slid over smooth river stones that bore no algae or moss. He knelt on the muddy bank and reached out with his gloved hand, stopping just inches short of the surface as a sudden spike of intense cold radiated off the water, freezing the breath in his throat, pushed deep into the mud right where the pin should have been sat a rotted pine stake, wrapped tightly in faded red surveyor's tape. Its top splintered as if struck by a heavy sledgehammer's blow. Mark pulled his notebook from his jacket to mark the discrepancy. But as he clicked his silver ballpoint pen, the ink inside the clear plastic tube instantly separated into tiny suspended black droplets, refusing to flow onto the dry paper. He set the pen aside and reached into his satchel for a charcoal pencil, his eyes catching a glint of weathered metal buried beneath a pile of damp hemlock branches a few feet further downstream. Brushing away the rotting pine needles, he uncovered an old aluminum Army surplus field box, its latch corroded shut with a crust of chalky white oxidation. He wedged the tip of his belt knife into the seam and pried it open with a dull metallic pop. Inside lay a small bound notebook with a cracked vinyl cover, its pages swollen with moisture but preserved by the dark oil that soaked the bottom of the tin. On the inside cover, written in dark blue fountain pen ink that had bled heavily into the fiber, was a single name, Henderson, followed by 6 numbered lines drafted in frantic heavy strokes. Mark turned the book toward the dim light filtering through the trees, reading the first entry out loud in a low whisper that seemed to vanish into the dense foliage without an echo. Rule 1. If the creek runs black and quiet, do not touch the water and do not set your tripod in the mud. Mark looked down at his boots, realizing with a cold jolt that he was already standing ankle deep in the dark sludge, his leatherwork boots sinking deeper into the frictionless mire with every passing second without making a single sound. The cold sludge seeped slowly through the leather seams of Mark's left boot, a freezing sensation that felt less like groundwater and more like liquid ice creeping up toward his ankle. He jerked his leg upward with a violent effort, the dark mud making a hollow, wet sound as it reluctantly released his foot. He stumbled backward onto the safety of the dry shale, breathing heavily through his nose while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked down at the vinyl notebook, still held tightly in his right hand, wiping a smear of dark grease from the second line of Henderson's frantic handwriting. Rule 2. If you find leather or metal buried in the soil, do not dig it up to inspect it. Leave it where the earth put it. Mark felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck as he glanced over at the half-buried aluminum field box he had just pried open, the metal lid now resting bent and silent against the damp hemlock branches. The surrounding forest seemed to draw in a long, deep breath, the branches of the ancient white oaks swaying slightly overhead. Even though there was not a single breath of wind moving through the hollow, he carefully tucked Henderson's notebook inside his internal coat pocket, pulling the zipper all the way up to his chin before turning back to his surveying gear. The heavy brass transit scope mounted on its wooden tripod sat precisely where he had left it, but when Mark stepped closer to look through the glass eyepiece, he froze. The crosshairs inside the lens were no longer aligned with the opposite bank of the creek. Instead, they were focused sharply on a thick cluster of dead laurels 50 yards up the slope, where a tall, shadowy figure stood completely motionless, its back turned toward him, wearing a faded canvas field jacket identical to his own. Mark pulled his head away from the scope, staring directly at the thicket with his bare eyes. But there was nothing there except the tangled gray branches and the drifting gray mist. He lowered his head and looked through the glass a second time. The figure was still there in the frame, only now it had turned slightly to the left, revealing a pale, smooth face with no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. Just a blank slate of gray skin that reflected the dull light of the afternoon sky. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the hillside above as a dry branch snapped in half. Mark swung his body around toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron crowbar strapped to his backpack, his feet moving in quick, deliberate steps away from the black stream and toward the ridgeline. He remembered the third rule written in the notebook. Never trust a sightline that stays still for more than 3 minutes. If the image in the scope does not blink or sway with the fog, pack your gear and move to higher ground immediately. Mark reached out to grab the wooden legs of his tripod, intending to collapse the frame and haul it up the mountain with him. But as his fingers brushed the polished oak wood, a jolt of static electricity shot through his hand, numbing his fingers all the way to the elbow. The brass barrel of the scope began to hum with a low vibrating pitch, the metal expanding rapidly under a sudden burst of intense heat that made the lacquer bubble and pop. He let go of the instrument instantly, stepping back as the heavy tripod slowly sank into the solid shale rock, as if the stone had turned to wet sand, swallowing the brass scope inch by inch until only the top cap remained visible above the gravel. Mark didn't wait to watch the rest vanish. He turned away and began scrambling up the steep shale incline on his hands and knees, loose rocks sliding out from under his boots and tumbling down into the silent black creek below, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps as the gradient grew steeper. The white trunks of the birch trees on the upper ridge leaning inward over the path like a ribcage, The air up here was thinner and carried a sharp chemical smell like burning rubber, mixed with the faint, distinct scent of fresh tobacco smoke. Mark paused on a narrow stone ledge to regain his footing, looking back down into the hollow he had just escaped. The entire drainage basin was now filled with a dense soup of white fog that rose steadily toward him like an overflowing basin of milk, hiding the creek, the truck, and the submerged tripod beneath a silent blank surface. From somewhere deep inside that fog came 3 distinct metallic knocks, deliberate and spaced exactly 2 seconds apart, sounding like a heavy hammer striking a steel survey pin driven deep into the heart of the mountain. The mountain trail grew narrower as Mark climbed higher along the eastern spine, the sharp shale giving way to deep black loam that smelled faintly of scorched wool and ancient dampness. His knees burned with every heavy step upward, while the weight of his leather pack pulled hard against his shoulder blades. He reached out to brace himself against the scaly trunk of a massive hemlock tree, but as his leather work glove pressed into the dark bark, the wood shifted under his palm like wet sponge, yielding to his weight with a soft, nauseating squelch. He pulled his hand back instantly, watching thick gray resin ooze from the impression his fingers had left, dripping down the trunk in long, sluggish strings that hissed quietly as they touched the soil below. He wiped his gloved hand against his trousers and reached inside his oilskin jacket to pull out Henderson's vinyl-bound notebook once again, flipping through the damp, warped pages until he reached the 3rd rule written in that jagged blue ink. Rule 3. If the trees begin to feel soft to the touch or yield under your weight, do not stop to rest against them, and do not lean your body toward the timber. Keep moving along the center of the ridge until you find a surveyor's stone, marked with a carved cross. Mark held his breath and scanned the surrounding forest, realizing that every single tree along this section of the ridge bore the same unnaturally smooth dark bark, their lowest branches drooping low across the narrow pathway like long skeletal arms, waiting to catch a passing shoulder. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead on the spine of the ridge, stepping carefully down the exact center of the mud path while avoiding even the slightest brush against the surrounding foliage. The silence around him had grown so absolute that the sound of his own heavy breathing and the crunch of wet gravel beneath his boots felt dangerously loud, as if every footstep was sending clear signals down into the fog-choked basin below. After 50 paces through the corridor of softening hemlocks, he spotted a low moss-covered granite stone half, buried in a pile of fallen chestnut leaves near a sharp bend in the trail. He rushed forward and dropped to one knee beside it, using his bare fingers to scrape away the thick green moss until the smooth, chiseled surface of the old boundary marker was revealed. Cut deep into the top face of the granite was a clear equal, armed cross with the letters Use carved below it in archaic serif lettering. Mark felt a brief surge of relief settle in his chest, taking a deep breath of the cold mountain air as he prepared to pull his compass from his pocket to verify his heading. But as he leaned closer to inspect the stone, he noticed that the carved cross was not filled with dirt or lichen like the rest of the rock. Instead, the deep grooves were filled with fresh crimson blood that remained bright and liquid, shimmering in the dim gray light of the afternoon. A sudden sharp smell of iron filled his nostrils, so pungent it made his eyes water and his throat tighten. He pulled back from the stone instantly, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he remembered the small footnote written at the bottom of Henderson's 3rd rule. If the cross bleeds, the boundary has been moved from behind you. Do not turn around to look at the path you just walked. Mark froze on his knees, his muscles locking tight as every instinct screamed at him to glance back, down the slope toward the hollow, where he had left his truck from the darkness behind him. No more than 20 feet down the trail he had just traversed came the distinct sound of heavy iron, shod boots stepping heavily through the damp leaves. The footfalls were slow, rhythmic, and deliberate, stopping abruptly every few seconds, as if whoever was following him was pausing to listen to his breath. Mark clenched his jaws shut and kept his eyes fixed strictly on the blood-filled cross in front of him, refusing to let his head turn even a fraction of an inch to the left or right. The footsteps began again, closer this time, accompanied by the dry, raspy sound of heavy canvas dragging across the wet brush. Then came a voice, low and distorted as if spoken through a long metal pipe filled with river water, calling his name in a flat, emotionless monotone. "Mark, Mark, you dropped your scope at the creek. Come down and help me lift it out of the mud." The voice was an exact mimicry of his own, using his exact pitch and cadence, but punctuated by a wet, bubbling gasp between every word. Mark pressed his lips together until they bled, closing his eyes tight and reciting the surveyor's coordinates of the district office in his head to keep his mind grounded. 647 North, 239 West, Section 4, Township 8. He repeated the numbers like a silent prayer, while the air behind his neck grew unnaturally cold, carrying a fall draft that smelled of rot and rusted iron. The sound of the heavy boots stepped right up to the edge of his heels, hovering there for 3 long, agonized minutes while the wet breathing rattled against his bare skin. Then, with a sharp snapping sound like an iron cable snapping under tension, the pressure behind him evaporated, the icy draft vanished, replaced by the normal damp chill of the autumn forest. Mark opened his eyes slowly, looking down at the granite stone in front of him. The crimson liquid inside the carved cross had turned into dry black crust, flaky and old, as if it had been dried by decades of exposure to the sun. He stood up on trembling legs, his body shaking with exhaustion, and took 3 long strides forward past the boundary marker, refusing to look back even once as he pushed deeper into the unmapped timber. The trail descended sharply into a narrow limestone gorge where the air grew thick with a suffocating damp heat that felt completely wrong for late October. White fog coiled tightly around the bases of jagged rock faces like boiling steam, making it impossible to see more than 5 feet ahead on the narrow ledge. Mark stepped cautiously down the slick limestone steps, carved naturally into the cliffside, his leather boots slipping on thin patches of dark moss that smelled of turned earth and sour milk. He kept one hand pressed against the icy rock wall to his left, feeling the coarse texture of frozen fossils buried deep within the stone under his fingers. After 20 yards of steep descent, the narrow ledge flattened out into a wide circular clearing, surrounded by towering gray cliffs that rose into the misty canopy, above like the walls of a ruined cathedral. In the precise center of the clearing sat an old concrete survey monument, 3 feet tall and capped with a tarnished brass disc that gleamed faintly in the gloom. Mark approached the pillar slowly, his eyes fixed on the rusted metal plate as he reached into his oilskin coat for Henderson's notebook, flipping past the warped pages until his thumb landed on the 4th rule drafted in that jagged blue ink. Rule 4. If you encounter a brass survey benchmark in a hollow where no benchmark is recorded, check the numbers stamped into the rim. If the year reads 1936, do not look up into the trees above the stone. Leave your metal tools on top of the concrete and walk backward until you reach the dry stream bed. Mark knelt beside the concrete pillar, keeping his chin tucked firmly against his chest so his vision remained locked on the ground. He wiped a layer of gray silt off the brass plate with the hem of his sleeve, revealing the hand, stamped block letters, United States Geological Survey, elevation 1,800 feet, and right at the bottom edge, stamped in deep irregular numerals, 1936. A sudden drop in atmospheric pressure made Mark's ears pop violently, followed by a low, dry rustling sound coming from high up in the oak canopy, directly above the benchmark. It sounded like hundreds of dry bed sheets being snapped in a stiff wind, accompanied by the distinct creak of heavy wooden boughs bending under an immense weight. Mark felt an intense biological urge to tilt his head back, to look up just for a fraction of a second to see what kind of creature or mechanism could produce such a massive dry movement in the quiet air. But he remembered the stark warning in the vinyl notebook. He reached up with trembling hands and unbuckled his heavy leather tool belt, letting his brass compass, iron crowbar, and steel tolly counter clatter loudly onto the flat top of the concrete monument, leaving every piece of metal he carried behind. He stood up slowly, keeping his gaze glued strictly to the worn toes of his leather boots and the wet gravel around the base of the pillar. He took his first step backward, his foot searching blindly behind him for solid footing on the slick shale. Then a second step, then a third. As he took his fourth step backward, something heavy and soft dropped from the canopy above, landing with a wet, dull thud on the exact spot where he had been standing 2 seconds prior. The impact vibrated through the soles of his boots, sending a cloud of fine white dust into the humid air. Mark kept his head down, refusing to look up at whatever had fallen from the dark trees. But in his peripheral vision, he could see long gray strands of coarse fiber, thick as clotheslines and covered in sticky clear sap, spilling outward across the gravel from the center of the clearing. The strands writhed slowly on the ground like dying worms, reaching out toward his boots. As if sensing his movement, Mark accelerated his backward pace, taking larger and longer strides while keeping his eyes locked on the ground. His heel caught the edge of a wet limestone shelf, and he nearly lost his balance, his arms flailing wildly in the air before he managed to right himself. He kept stepping backward through the dense fog until his spine made hard contact with a vertical rock face, the impact knocking the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. He stayed frozen against the cold limestone, listening as the dry, snapping sound in the canopy above slowly receded into the distance, leaving only the quiet rhythmic dripping of condensation from the mossy rocks. He looked down at his bare hands, his palms covered in gray grit and sweat, realization sinking in that he was now deep inside the dead drainage with no compass, no steel tools, and no way to measure his heading except for the cryptic warnings left behind in a dead surveyor's book. The damp limestone gorge gradually opened into a broad oval basin where the air hung heavy and motionless, carrying a suffocating scent that reminded Mark of old wool blankets stored in a damp cellar. Without his brass compass or steel tools, his hands felt strangely light and exposed, hanging limply at his sides as he navigated the faint game trail that cut through the tall ferns. The sky above had dissolved into a uniform sheet of milky gray slate, offering no shadow or solar position to judge the passing hours. Every trunk of red oak and shagbark hickory stood perfectly vertical and symmetrical, forming a hypnotic wooden lattice that made it nearly impossible to gauge whether he was walking in a straight line or tracing a vast, endless circle around the base of the mountain. He pulled his oilskin coat tighter around his chest, feeling the sharp rectangular outline of Henderson's vinyl-bound notebook pressed against his ribs like a cold shield. He stopped beside a massive fallen log that had rotted into a trough of soft orange punky wood, reaching inside his coat to pull out the book with slow, deliberate movements. The fifth rule was written across 2 pages in jagged, uneven script, as if the author had been writing while marching in the dark. Rule 5. If you come across a abandoned timber camp with 3 log cabins and a steel saw blade hanging from an oak tree, do not walk between the cabins. Walk entirely around the western perimeter of the clearing. If you hear an iron triangle chime 3 times from inside the mess hall, immediately drop to the ground and lie flat until you hear the sound of a crosscut saw starting up. Mark closed the book and tucked it back into his pocket, his eyes scanning the dense understory ahead. 30 yards down the sloping path, the tangled mountain laurel gave way to a cleared patch of earth, where 3 rotting timber cabins stood in a tight triangular formation. Their hand-hewn cedar shingles were buckled and covered in thick mats of gray lichen, while their stone chimneys had collapsed inward, filling the open doorways with piles of rubble. Suspended from a thick branch of an ancient white oak in the center of the yard hung a massive rusted circular saw blade, 5 feet across, its jagged teeth coated in a flaky crust of orange rust. The blade swayed slightly back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion, even though there was not a single breath of wind touching the ferns around Mark's boots. A low metallic groan vibrated through the silent air as the rusted arbor hole rubbed against the forged iron hook holding it aloft. Mark stepped off the main path and began making a wide circuit around the western edge of the clearing, keeping his body far away from the narrow gaps between the log structures. His boots sank deep into carpeted moss, making no sound as he skirted the base of a jagged rock outcrop. As he reached the midway point of the western curve, his eye caught a pale shape sitting on a decayed stump at the edge of the cabin wall. It was an old galvanized iron mesh triangle, suspended from a bent framing nail. The heavy iron striker hung beside it on a piece of rotted jute twine. Completely motionless, Mark kept his eyes fixed on his footing, taking long, cautious strides while staying beneath the shadow of the cliff face. Suddenly, without any visible movement from the striker or the wind, the iron triangle let out a single sharp chime that shattered the silence of the hollow. The sound was impossibly loud, a high, pitched ringing frequency that vibrated directly inside Mark's skull, causing a sharp blinding pain behind his eyes. A second later came the second chime, deeper and more resonant than the first, echoing off the limestone cliffs like a rifle shot. Mark didn't wait for the third strike. He threw himself forward onto his stomach, burying his face into the damp leaf litter and clasping his hands tightly over the back of his neck, his elbows digging into the cold mud. 2 seconds passed in total absolute quiet. Then the third chime rang out, a flat dead clank that seemed to absorb all remaining ambient noise from the forest. The air temperature around Mark plummeted instantly, turning his warm breath into thick clouds of white vapor that hovered above the wet oak leaves. From inside the central cabin, the dark void of the glassless window frame began to emit a rhythmic, rasping noise. It was the sound of a long two-man crosscut saw dragging through dry oak wood, pushing and pulling in a steady, deliberate cadence, forward and back, the iron teeth biting into hard timber with a wet, rhythmic screech that set Mark's teeth on edge, accompanied by the low, gravelly voices of 2 men arguing in muffled undertones about board feet and boundary lines. Mark kept his forehead pressed against the dirt, his eyes squeezed shut as he felt a heavy vibration ripple through the ground beneath his chest. Something massive was dragging a heavy iron chain across the perimeter of the clearing, the heavy links clanking against the exposed rock ledges just 10 feet away from where he lay. The smell of fresh wood shavings and hot machine oil filled the air, so thick and concentrated that Mark had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. He stayed completely motionless on the ground, counting his heartbeats in the dark while the rhythmic rasp of the saw grew faster and louder, reaching a fever pitch that sounded like rending metal. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sawing stopped. A heavy wooden door slammed shut with a concussive thud that rattled the fillings in his teeth, and the oppressive heat of the timber camp vanished. Mark waited 5 long minutes before slowly lifting his head from the mud, brushing dead leaves from his chin and eyes. The clearing was empty. The rusted circular saw blade hanging from the oak tree was completely still, its orange surface coated in a fresh layer of pale, gray frost that glittered under the dull light. He pushed himself up from the ground on shaky legs and sprinted past the western edge of the timber camp, refusing to look back at the log cabins as he plunged back into the thick, dark timber. The narrow path beyond the timber camp wound steeply upward along the spine of a razorback ridge where the white oak trees grew stunted and twisted, their thick branches gnarled like swollen joints against the gray sky. Mark climbed with slow, rhythmic steps, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic air that pooled in the upper elevations. His oilskin coat was heavy with absorbed mist, and his bare hands were scraped and raw from clutching wet stone ledges during his ascent. Without his watch or compass, time had lost its linear structure, stretched thin by the unending silence of the mountain. He paused on a small flat bench of sandstone to catch his breath, reaching into his inner coat pocket to retrieve Henderson's vinyl-bound journal. His thumb traced the 6th and final rule written on the stained paper in faint, runny blue ink that was rapidly fading under the damp mountain air. Rule 6. If you reach the ridge summit and find a second surveyor's tripod already set up with a brass transit pointing down into the opposite hollow, do not look through the glass, do not speak, and do not touch the brass knobs. Step up to the eyepiece, place your hand over the objective lens for 5 seconds, then turn around and walk directly back down the mountain without stopping, until you hear the sound of traffic on the state highway. Mark closed the book, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach as he realized what the final rule implied. There was no continuation past the summit, no exit through the eastern valley. The only way out of the dead drainage was to trace his steps backward through every territory he had just survived. He slid the notebook back into his pocket, adjusting his collar against the icy draft that swept across the sandstone ledge, and pushed himself up the final steep incline toward the summit peak. As he crested the top of the ridge, the dense forest abruptly ended, opening into a barren rocky plateau whipped by a howling frost wind. In the center of the clearing sat a surveyor's brass transit scope mounted on a blackened oak tripod, its legs driven deep into the fissured rock, pointing its long brass tube down into the pitch, black hollow on the far side of the mountain. Mark approached the tripod with deliberate steps, his eyes locked on the heavy brass fittings that shone with an unearthly polish, free of any rust or patina despite the harsh mountain weather. As he reached the instrument, he saw a small white card tied to the leveling screw with copper wire, bearing his own full name and hand, written coordinates in fresh black ink. Mark took a deep breath, swallowing the cold lump in his throat, and stepped directly up to the brass transit. Obeying the final rule with absolute precision, he kept his head turned away from the glass eyepiece, raised his right hand, and pressed his leather, gloved palm firmly over the objective lens at the front of the barrel, counting the seconds silently in his mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Beneath his palm, the cold glass of the lens suddenly began to pulse like a living heart, radiating an intense feverish heat that warmed his glove, accompanied by a low muffled whisper vibrating directly through the brass body of the scope, sounding like Henderson's voice speaking from deep underwater. It was a list of names, dozens of them, read out in a flat, endless tally that Mark recognized as the missing personnel records from the county survey archives. Mark pulled his hand away as if scorched by flame, spun around on his heel, and began his long descent back down the ridge, refusing to look at the dark hollow stretching out behind him. The mountain was no longer silent. From the thickets on either side of the trail came the sound of rustling branches, snapping twigs, and the distinct heavy thud of multiple footfalls marching alongside him in the mist, keeping pace with his exact rhythm. Mark kept his eyes fixed strictly on the center of the narrow path, reciting his field coordinates under his breath, while the cold wind carried a chorus of familiar voices calling out from the tree line, urging him to stop, to rest, to turn around and look at the summit one last time. He pressed forward into the descending gray fog, his boots striking the shale with relentless speed, as the dark hollow below prepared to receive him once again for the return journey. The descent back into the mid-elevation basin felt far longer than the climb up, as if the mountain had stretched its slopes downward like slack skin. Mark's knees trembled with the constant braking action required on the loose, wet shale, his vision narrowing to the tiny circle of light cast by the failing gray day. The air grew noticeably thicker and warmer as he reached the perimeter of the abandoned timber camp, carrying that same sickening reek of hot machine oil and fresh wood shavings. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the narrow dirt path beneath his boots, making the wide western arc around the 3 rotting cabins, while keeping his head bowed low. But as he crossed the invisible boundary of the camp's outer yard, the air around him froze into a terrifying, unnatural pressure. The silence was shattered by a high-pitched, metallic screech that sounded like a massive iron saw blade being dragged across cold granite. Mark flinched, but kept moving forward, taking long, rhythmic strides while counting each step out loud in a flat voice to keep from panicking. 1, 2, 3. From the dark, open doorway of the mess hall to his left came the distinct sound of heavy iron boots stepping out onto the gravel, accompanied by the dry, raspy breathing of something that had no lungs. The footsteps moved rapidly across the yard, cutting directly across the gap between the cabins toward his position on the western trail. Mark remembered the absolute prohibition against looking at the structures or stepping between them. He quickened his pace into a near sprint, his oilskin coat flapping violently against his thighs as he skirted the edge of the rock face. Behind him, the heavy iron chain began to drag across the shale once more, its massive links clanking against the stone with a rhythmic, deliberate weight that was gaining on him fast. The sound was so close now that Mark could feel the vibration through the heels of his boots, bringing with it a freezing draft that smelled of stale blood and wet iron. He pressed his knuckles into his teeth to keep from screaming, refusing to turn his neck even a fraction of an inch to see what was pulling the chain. He surged past the final collapsed chimney, his boots splashing through a shallow pool of black, stagnant water that had gathered in the trail, and plunged back into the dense corridor of hemlocks. The moment his body passed the western boundary marker, the sound of the iron chain stopped dead with a sharp, concussive crack, like a thick cable snapping under extreme tension, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing echoing through the dim timber. Mark slowed to a rapid walk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But he knew there was no time to rest. The forest was darkening rapidly, the pale gray sky above dissolving into a deep, bruise-colored purple, and the next territory he had to cross was the ridge of soft, yielding trees where the bleeding stone marker lay waiting in the gloom. The corridor of softening hemlock seemed to have shrunk in the gathering dusk, its narrow dirt path compressed on both sides by the looming trunks that leaned inward at unnatural, impossible angles. The air was cold enough to turn Mark's breath into thick gray plumes, yet the bark of every ancient white oak and hemlock oozed long sluggish strings of pale resin that hissed faintly as they dripped onto the black loam. He walked with his hands tucked tight against his ribs, his shoulders hunched to prevent even his oilskin coat from brushing against the yielding wood. Every tree in this section had developed a distinct spongy texture, the bark looking less like timber and more like cold, saturated leather stretched tightly over decaying muscle. Mark kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his boots striking the exact middle of the trail with deliberate, heavy rhythm. The silence in the hollow had deepened to a point where he could hear the faint, wet squelch of the tree trunks expanding and contracting in the dark, as if the entire forest was breathing in unison with his own ragged lungs. After 50 agonizing paces, he spotted the low granite boundary stone half, buried in the pile of fallen leaves near the bend, its moss stripped away from his previous pass. The chiseled cross cut into its top face sat black and motionless under the dim twilight, but as Mark stepped closer, he saw that the liquid crimson inside the grooves was no longer dry. It had refilled to the brim, bubbling softly like a small open vein cut deep into the rock. He froze 2 steps away from the marker, remembering the footnote in Henderson's book with a chilling clarity. If the cross bleeds, the boundary has been moved from behind you. Do not turn around to look at the path you just walked. Mark took a slow, shallow breath, holding his position on the narrow path, while the woods behind him came alive with sound. It was not the sound of wind or falling branches, but the sharp rhythmic crack of heavy iron, shod boots stepping through the wet leaves. The footfalls were slow and measured, stopping precisely 10 feet behind his left heel. The air behind his neck turned instantly frigid, carrying a thick foul stench of stagnant river mud, wet dog fur, and rusted iron. Then came the voice again, low and distorted, as if pushing through a throat filled with silt, speaking in Mark's own voice. "Mark, you dropped your compass on the upper ridge. I brought it down for you. Turn around and take it back from my hand." The tone was flat, completely devoid of inflection, yet the cadence matched his own speech patterns down to the brief pause between syllables. Mark clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, pressing his teeth together until his jaw ached, refusing to let his chin shift toward the sound. 647 North, 239 West, Section 4, Township 8. He repeated the district survey coordinates in his head like a protective mantra, his eyes glued to the dark granite cross on the ground. The footsteps took 2 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance until Mark could feel a wet, icy pressure against the back of his oilskin jacket, as if someone was standing directly behind him, leaning their forehead against his spine. A long, bubbling gasp rattled out from the darkness, followed by the dry, raspy scrape of heavy canvas rubbing against canvas. Mark kept his eyes locked on the bleeding stone, his legs shaking violently under his own weight as he fought the overwhelming physical urge to glance over his shoulder. The wet pressure on his back grew heavier, pressing him forward an inch at a time toward the soft, bleeding hemlocks on the edge of the path. He dug his boots into the black loam, anchoring his body against the force while repeating the numbers louder in his mind. Section 4, Township 8, 647 North. Then came a sharp metallic click, the distinct sound of a brass transit scope being leveled on a tripod directly behind his ear, followed by the low voice again, whispering right into his ear canal. "Look through the glass, Mark. It's almost dark, and you need to see where you're walking." A drop of cold, thick fluid fell onto Mark's collar, running down the bare skin of his neck like ice water. He closed his eyes tight, took a violent breath, and took 3 fast, heavy strides forward, leaping right over the granite stone without looking down or looking back. The moment his boots cleared the marker, the heavy pressure on his spine vanished into nothingness. The icy draft evaporated, replaced by the normal damp chill of the evening timber. Mark did not stop to check his coat. He broke into a rapid, jarring trot down the descending slope, his boots sliding through loose shale as he plunged deeper into the dark ravine where the Black Creek waited in the shadows below. The trail flattened out into the bottomland, where the Black Creek flowed in absolute silence, its dark viscous surface reflecting the deep, purple-bruised light of the dying sky like a mirror made of cold oil. Mark descended the final shale bank on his hands and knees, his oilskin coat plastered against his back with cold sweat, his boots caked in thick gray clay that weighed down his legs like lead. The air at the bottom of the hollow was frigid and dense, carrying a sharp metallic tang that filled his mouth with the taste of copper and wet iron. He paused at the edge of the streambed, his breathing ragged and hollow, as he reached inside his jacket for Henderson's vinyl notebook. The pages were now so damp that the ink on the earlier pages had bled into vast blue smears, but the instructions for the creek remained stark and legible. He flipped to the original entry near the front. Rule 1. If the creek runs black and quiet, do not touch the water and do not set your tripod in the mud. And the unwritten corollary he had learned on his way up. If you must cross on your return, step only on the dry gray boulders that bear no moss, and never let your reflection meet your eyes in the dark water. Mark tucked the journal back into his coat, his eyes scanning the narrow crossing where the stream narrowed between 2 jagged limestone outcrops. 5 smooth sandstone boulders protruded from the black, slick surface like a row of broken teeth. Completely dry and stripped clean of any algae or river silt, he stepped up to the first stone, his left boot balancing carefully on the narrow crest, while his eyes remained glued strictly to the dry rock face in front of him, avoiding even the slightest glance down at the calm black mirror. Flowing inches beneath his soles, he took a breath, held his body rigid, and leaped to the second boulder, his boots making a dry, hollow click against the stone that sounded startlingly loud in the dead quiet of the hollow. As his feet landed on the third rock in the middle of the current, the silent black water around the boulders suddenly began to ripple, not from a current or a rising fish, but from deep underneath, swirling into tight, smooth vortices that made no sound as they spun from the center of the dark stream. Right alongside his boots, a pale shape began to float upward toward the surface, drifting like a fallen birch leaf rising through dark glass. Mark kept his gaze locked straight ahead at the far bank, but in his lower peripheral vision, he could see the unmistakable outline of a human face settling just beneath the clear top layer of the black fluid. It was his own face, distorted and pale, its eyes wide open and staring directly upward into the sky. Its mouth open in a silent, frozen scream. The lips of the reflection began to move, forming words without producing a single ripple or sound in the water. Mark, look down. You dropped your pencil in the silt. Look down and pick it up." The voice did not travel through the air. It vibrated directly up through the soles of his work boots. shaking his ankles with a rhythmic pulse that threatened to throw off his balance. Mark gritted his teeth, shifting his weight forward onto his right foot while fixing his eyes on a dead hemlock stump on the far bank. 647 North, 239 West, Section 4, Township 8. He repeated the coordinates out loud this time, his raw voice rasping against his dry throat. The sound of his voice seemed to agitate the water, the black fluid rising up the sides of the sandstone boulders like thick ink, lapping against the soles of his leather boots. A sudden spike of extreme cold shot through the leather, numbing his toes instantly and making his knees tremble. The pale face beneath the water multiplied. 2, 3, 4 identical faces crowding around the rocks, all staring upward with wide, empty eyes, their mouths moving in unison as the vibration through his legs grew stronger. Mark took a desperate leap toward the fourth boulder, his heel slipping slightly on the slick curved edge, his balance faltering as his left arm flailed out to catch the air. A drop of the black water splashed onto his bare wrist, sending a sharp, blinding pain through his forearm like a needle made of ice. He bit his lower lip hard enough to draw blood, using the pain to anchor his mind, and propelled his body forward in a final violent lunges toward the muddy shore. His boots slammed into the dry shale of the far bank, his momentum carrying him forward onto his hands and knees in the wet gravel. He scrambled upward on all fours away from the water's edge, refusing to look back at the Black Creek, his heart hammering against his ribs as he pulled himself up against the trunk of a fallen chestnut tree. He looked down at his left wrist where the droplet had landed. A small round circle of skin had turned ash gray and numb, completely dead to the touch, but he was across. The Black Creek lay behind him in the dark, and 50 yards through the thick laurel thicket, he could see the faint metallic outline of his green pickup truck sitting silent in the gloom. The pale green pickup truck sat like an abandoned iron corpse in the turnaround, its hood cold and glistening with a heavy coat of frost that had crystallized in the gathering blackness of the mountain night. Mark stumbled out of the laurel thicket, his body trembling violently from exhaustion and the lingering, icy deadness in his left wrist. Every breath burned his throat like swallowed glass, carrying that relentless metallic smell of rusted iron and stagnant river mud. He reached the driver's side door and grabbed the chrome handle with his trembling right hand, pulling it upward with a sharp jerk. But the iron mechanism was frozen solid, locked tight by a thin shell of clear ice that bound the rubber seal to the frame. He pressed his shoulder against the door, slamming his body weight into the rusted panel until the ice shattered with a loud crack, allowing the heavy door to swing open into the dark cabin. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut instantly and pulling the manual lock down with his thumb. The interior of the cab was pitch black and frigid, smelling faintly of old coffee, damp wool, and his own dried sweat. He reached into his pocket with numb fingers, pulling out his heavy brass ignition key. His hands were shaking so hard it took him 3 attempts to line the key up with the ignition slot. When he finally pushed the steel key home and turned it forward, the engine gave a single dull, pathetic click from beneath the hood, then fell completely silent. The battery was dead, drained entirely by the unnatural cold that hung over the drainage. Mark slammed his palm against the steering wheel in frustration, cursing under his breath as he reached across the vinyl seat to grab his emergency hand crank flashlight from the glove box. He wound the plastic crank rapidly, the small dynamo whirring like an angry wasp in the dark, until a weak yellow beam of light cut through the gloom of the cab. He turned the beam toward the windshield, and his blood instantly ran cold. The glass was not covered in normal feather, like frost patterns from the outside wind. Instead, from the inside of the glass, traced in thick, wet grease, was a message written in a frantic, backward script. Rule 7. If the engine will not start, do not get out to check the battery. Sit in the center of the bench seat, pull your knees to your chest, and keep your eyes fixed on the rearview mirror until the sun touches the hood. Mark stared at the grease marks, his heart hammering against his ribs, so hard he could feel it vibrating through his teeth. There was no Rule 7 in Henderson's notebook. He pulled the vinyl book from his coat with a frantic tear, flipping through the damp, swollen pages under the weak yellow beam of his hand. Crank flashlight, the 6 rules he had followed were still there, written in that faded, runny blue ink, but the back cover, which had been blank when he opened the box at the creek, was now covered in fresh, wet black grease. The handwriting matched the backward script on his windshield, drafted in long, frantic strokes. Rule 7. The man who wrote this book did not escape. He is sitting on the tailgate of your truck right now, waiting for you to turn the key again. Mark dropped the book onto the floorboard, as if it had turned into a coal, his breathing coming in shallow, frantic gasps that filled the cold cab with dense white steam. He scrambled over the gear shift, sliding his body into the precise middle of the bench seat, away from both the driver and passenger doors. He pulled his knees tightly against his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins, and tilted his head upward to look into the small rectangular rearview mirror mounted above the dashboard. The small mirror reflected the pitch black void of the truck bed behind him, framed by the dark outline of the rear window glass. For 3 agonizing minutes, nothing moved in the dark, the silence of the hollow pressing against the glass like a physical weight. Then, a sharp metallic groan echoed from the back of the truck as the suspension compressed under a sudden, heavy weight. The truck bed creaked loudly, the iron springs groaning under the strain as if a massive, waterlogged log had been dropped onto the tailgate. Mark kept his eyes locked strictly on the small glass mirror, refusing to turn his head toward the rear window. In the dim reflection cast by the pale moon struggling through the canopy, he saw a dark shape slowly rise above the rim of the tailgate. It was a tall man wearing a shredded oilskin coat, his head resting at an unnatural, broken angle against his left shoulder. His face was a smooth, features, gray slate, completely devoid of eyes or a mouth, but covered in a thick layer of wet black mud that dripped onto the corrugated iron of the truck bed with a slow, rhythmic splat. Splat, splat. The creature began to crawl forward on its hands and knees, dragging its legs behind it like dead timber, its movements jagged and mechanical. With every forward pull, its pale gray fingers scraped against the metal lining of the truck bed, making a high, pitched screech that set Mark's teeth on edge. It reached the back window of the cab, its smooth face pressing directly against the cold glass, leaving a wide oval smear of dark grease. From inside the creature's chest came a low, vibrating hum that rattled the truck's dashboard, speaking in Henderson's voice, clear and unhurried as if reading an official survey report. Mark, you forgot to sign the ledger at the creek. You can't submit a boundary map without a final signature. Turn around and give me your pen. Mark clenched his jaw tight, digging his fingernails into his palms until the skin broke. Keeping his eyes glued strictly to the mirror, 647 North, 239 West, Section 4, Township 8, he repeated the coordinates in his mind, over and over, building a mental wall against the rhythmic scraping of the creature's fingers on the glass. The creature raised a heavy, mud-caked fist and struck the rear window, once, twice, 3 times. The concussive force rattling the entire frame of the truck and sending spiderweb cracks through the safety glass. But Mark did not blink. He did not turn his head, and he did not speak a single word into the dark cab. He sat motionless in the center of the seat, holding his knees to his chest while the freezing cold seeped deep into his bones, counting every heartbeat as the long night stretched into an eternity of silence and shadow. Hours passed like slow drips of dark oil, until the first faint thread of pale blue light began to bleed through the eastern trees, illuminating the frost on the hood of the truck. The heavy weight in the bed suddenly vanished, the suspension rising with a sharp iron click, and the dark grease on the rear glass dried into harmless white dust that blew away in the morning breeze. Mark waited until the first ray of orange sunlight struck the center of the hood. Then he reached forward with a trembling hand, turned the brass key in the ignition, and the heavy V8 engine roared to life on the very first try, sending a cloud of dark exhaust into the cold air as he threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the dead drainage. leaving the unmapped forest behind forever.